Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Osebol, I hope I'm saying that correctly, by Marit, Kapla, and translated by Peter Graves. I don't know why I did that accent. Here we go. I'd been talking about this book. I mentioned a little bit about wanting to read it this year, as sort of part of tackling some big books that I've been eyeing up. And it's one of those books that sort of, apparently, I mean, it seems to have been a bit of a sleeper hit in its original Swedish, and it's sort of caught on in quite other interesting ways. It won the Women in Translation Prize at the end of last year. It was a joint winner alongside Tomb of Sand by Gitanjali Tree and translated by Daisy Rockwell. And so it sort of has already this sort of, it has sort of something behind it. It had a prize, which obviously made me check it out a little bit more. But actually, at the heart of it, I was just really intrigued by the premise of this idea, of this book, rather. And the whole key premise of the book is that a series of interviews have been carried out. This is a sort of non-fiction book. A series of interviews have been carried out with people living in this town, Osebol, and they are asked just sort of to almost freeform speak a little bit about their experiences of growing up or spending time around that area. Some of them did grow up there. Some of them have been there since birth. Some of them moved there really recently. Some of them, their family moved sort of 20, 30 years ago. And so everybody has this very different take on what this village means to them, what this sort of village life means to them as well. And it's then sort of threaded through. So we get this non-fiction kind of appearing almost like poems, these sort of little fragments of people saying things. And as a result, they kind of just speak for themselves. These villagers basically all just share something about their relationship with the land and with the community and with the area around them. And so we kind of just get this sort of patchwork book. And that's kind of, I think, mostly what appealed to me in the idea of it, is how you turn interviews, sort of semi-structured interviews, into a narrative, and how you really tie all of those together. And I think it's incredibly successful in doing so. There aren't really spoilers to speak of in this book, so please don't worry. Partly because, we're not following a conventional plot. People will share various bits about their lives. And I think just as a collection of narratives, it's just really worth just letting this whole thing really wash over you. I think it works in a really gorgeous way when that happens. So let's get talking about a little bit more about what the book actually talks about. So we start following a set of sort of threads, and sometimes they're grouped together a little bit. So, for example, somebody might start talking about what it was like in the 60s, and how, the games that they played, were all around. You were given a stick and a piece of thread or whatever. You made a game out of it. You did your own thing. And a lot of the people in this book talk about how, everything's changed now. Things are this really modern pace of life, and now kids just only want to be playing on their phones, and it's antisocial and blah, 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 blah. Kind of typical things that you might expect to hear when we have sort of intergenerational dialogue, I guess. But what I think is particularly interesting about how those are threaded together is that sometimes you get these quite startling revelations, right? That it's not only that these people grew up around in a very different time, and that things were very different for them, and now they think things have changed too much or whatever. Actually, sometimes you get these other sort of revelations from people about how this village life is their way forward and their way of mitigating against some of that actually that's their way of preserving a feeling of the past or knowledge of the past. People who have moved, particularly from bigger cities like Stockholm, and have moved to Osebol, with the idea being that they're going to, experience things really differently, that this is their attempt at sort of almost rewilding themselves or going back to nature. And so actually, there's this sort of generational shift. We've watched how lots of young people are leaving the area, and we have older people moving back to either retire or to spend more time in places that they came up again, that they spend a lot of time in as kids. And actually we see a little bit of the insight into how other people perceive this. So there are quite a few city dwellers who see the move towards a small village like Osebol as being a distinctly negative thing and a sort of retrograde step of really going backwards and not understanding the brilliant things that a city can bring to you. And actually, equally, that's why lots of young people are leaving the town, because they don't have all the fun, exciting things around them that they want. And so we sort of see that this demographic shift becomes this really fascinating part of the book. And this is where actually I think the book, I'm really torn on this. I think partly I would have preferred it, I think, if this part wasn't in the book. This is maybe the only sort of sore point of the book for me, was we do, with these characters speaking incredibly frankly about how the village has changed, they also bring up the topic of immigration. And what we then do get on a couple of occasions is some people saying something along the lines of, that old well-trodden sort of phrase of like, oh, well, we should look after our own people first before we look after any immigrants or what have you. And this feels particularly strange in the book, because so much of this book is quite soft and gentle and revolves around these characters finding ways of understanding things that are happening and understanding changes around them. And then sometimes we get characters who sort of say these things unchecked. And I guess it's us as the readers who are there to kind of say, well, actually, I disagree, particularly as we meet so many characters who are immigrants from other nearby European nations. We have a few people from Poland and Denmark and Norway and the Netherlands living in this village. And we wouldn't necessarily that seems to pass unremarked. And actually, the thing that I then find quite frustrating, sort of reading some of those reports, is, well, yeah, these are people who are immigrants in their own rights as well, but it's just they're white and they're European, and therefore, for some people in the book, that's sort of overlooked. And so that's the part that I find quite uncomfortable, is leaving that in the book kind of unchecked feels quite tricky. But at the same time, I guess it's a raw, acknowledgement of what somebody said. This thing is said. Most other things in the book are said uncritically. People saying, oh, technology is ruining everything is also presented uncritically. But I think that, I don't know, I felt that there was a particular responsibility there to either, have some kind of caveat or a sort of competing thing, or even, to actually have one of the voices of an immigrant sort of directly following that to kind of give a bit of a shape to what that was. Anyway, that was maybe my only one major sort of quibble. So quibble seems a bit minor for that, but with the book was sort of that inclusion feels quite strange. But on the flip side, I think this book also then engages with a lot of other really interesting conversations about generational shifts, because actually not that many people in the book are younger folk, partly because there aren't that many around in this village. We're talking about a small forested village. There's a map right at the beginning of the book, and we sort of see increasingly just sort of how remote this is within even the sort of geography of Sweden, that, kind of big cities sort of down here and then this little village right up here. And so what are the reasons why a young person would stay in somewhere like this small village when this sort of whole wider world exists outside for them? And so I think this book, as a result, has this sort of straddles this interesting line of being in many ways a document of what's happened. These interviews were done fairly recently, in the last sort of 5 years or so, and therefore this is a sort of snapshot of where people are in this village. And I kind of now want to see this book followed up in 10, 15, 20 years time to sort of see, are we still here? Are we still in the same place in terms of our understanding about this? Because it feels like such a specific, focused area, and one that wouldn't, initially seem like it made the most sense to do this whole deep study on in this way, or to have a book be a bestseller coming from it. But I think does some really deeply interesting things nonetheless. So I really, really, really enjoyed this, with those issues very much kind of as caveats here. But I'm kind of intrigued to see what other people thought, just because it's won or been shortlisted for a couple of prizes. It seems to have sort of had this sort of prominence and this success. And I think part of it is just these are voices that we don't often hear in our literature in quite the same way. We don't often hear the voices of quote unquote ordinary folk. I hate that term, but you know what I mean. The sort of working class folk, or people whose lives are exceptional in how unexceptional they are. People grow, they're born, they grow up, they die, they have relationships, they do whatever. And capturing some of those things feels quite interesting because we don't often hear those people in quite the same way. Anyway, I've been Bod Booker, rambling about this little book. Intrigued to hear your thoughts if you have had a chance to read it. And I still would really recommend checking it out, even with, again, my sort of slight concerns about it. Either way, because I think it's a really beautiful, pensive, and sort of pleasant read that lets, you just sort of let it all wash over you, really, as well. Anyway, take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.